Hello and welcome to the session on occasionalism. Occasionalism, version of Cartesian metaphysics that flourished in the last half of the 17th century, in which all interaction between mind and body is mediated by God. It is posited that unextended mind and extended body do not interact directly. The appearance of direct interaction is maintained by God, who moves the body on the occasion of the mind's willing and who puts ideas in the mind on the occasion of the body's encountering other material objects. For example, when a person actualizes his desire to pick up an apple, his mind does not act on his body directly, but his willing of the action is the occasion for God to make his arm reach out. And when his hand grasps the apple does not act on his mind directly, but the contact is the occasion for God to give him ideas of the apple's coolness and softness. The Cartesian occasionalists generally made appeal to the doctrine as a solution to the problem of mind-body interaction. This interpretation actually has its origin in the period itself. Both G.W. Leibniz and Bernard Le Boré de Fontenelle notably described occasionalism as primarily a reaction to Descartes' failure to explain the mind-body union. Nonetheless, Leibniz and Fontenelle were mistaken in their interpretations. While the commitments of individual philosophers varied, in its pure form, occasionalism was a global denial of causality outside the direct and immediate volitional activity of God, both between bodies and between minds and bodies. This is important to note as it forms the locus of the distinction between three classic metaphysical models of the causal relationship between God and His creation: occasionalism, concurrentism, conservationism. Conservationism can best be described as the common view among the lay followers of the Abrahamic faith, as Malebranche himself notes. It holds that God created the world in the beginning. Since that moment, and with the exception of miracles, the world runs causally of its own accord and on the basis of its own powers and principles, without the need for God to be continually and perpetually involved. In spite of its mass appeal, conservationism was almost never taken seriously by Christian or Islamic theologians and was denounced as unorthodox for a variety of reasons that need not concern us here. For the much more important historical distinction was between concurrentism and occasionalism. Owing its origins to Augustine, concurrentism became the causal metaphysic of Saint Thomas Aquinas and his legion followers. It holds that both God and finite created causes contribute to the production of particular effects, namely that God concurs or assents to the natural activity of the cause and thereby contributes His potency to the production of its effects, without which such a cause would be impotent and incapable of producing its customary effects. Occasionalism, by contrast, holds that finite creatures are utterly impotent by themselves, contribute nothing metaphysically to the production of any effects to which they may be associated, but instead serve only as merely nominal indicators or occasions for the one sole cause of the universe, God. Thus, while Aquinas' account of the regular operations of nature is grounded in a grand system of agent causes and their patience, for the occasionalist, the regular operations of nature are governed by a system of occasional causes that cohere only on the basis of the regularity of God's will concerning them. This raises the question, what exactly is an occasional cause? One example would be a placebo, a designation that could be applied to almost anything but is understood as such insofar as it serves as the cause of the placebo effect. Yet, as has been noted in clinical analysis of the placebo effect, this causal conception is clearly mistaken insofar as a placebo is typically an inert, compound or pointless therapy that does not actually cause anything in particular, much less its salutary effect. Nonetheless, without the presence and administration of the placebo, the effect would not follow, or not follow as often as it does, and thus a placebo may be understood as an indispensable cause that serves as the occasion for whatever psychophysical causality that takes place in the body which produces the placebo effect. So then, what does an occasionalist metaphysic, an account of causality, look like? Well, to begin with, the classic example of mind-body interaction: when I look out the window of my office, there is no real causal connection between the clouds and sky as physical objects and the representative idea I have of them in my mind. Rather, God immediately and directly produces such a correspondent image in my mind upon the occasion of me turning my head and looking out the window at them. Similarly, there is no real causal connection between the activity of my will to turn my head to the right and look out my window and the physical action of my head turning. For my head moves on the basis of the physical contraction of opposing muscle groups in my neck, which pull on and rotate my cervical vertebrae, thereby effecting the turn. This elaborate metaphysical and theological description of such a simple action raises the question: why would any philosopher advance such a bizarre and counterintuitive theory to explain such basic phenomena? Module 2: Motivations for Occasionalism. Given the customary prejudice of philosophers towards occasionalism, it is necessary to consider the motivation underlying such a strange doctrine, which nonetheless attracted many of the greatest minds of medieval and early modern philosophy. The main figures behind the development of occasionalist thought in the Middle Ages were, as might be expected, concerned predominantly with theological issues. Numerous passages in the Old and New Testament are ambiguously suggestive of an occasionalist reading. To quote one passage cited by Malebranche in favor of occasionalism: "This is what the Lord, your protector, says, the one who formed you in the womb. I am the Lord who made everything, who alone stretched out the sky, who fashioned the earth all by myself." However, such scriptural testimony was far too ambiguous to inspire or justify occasionalism on its own terms. Rather, occasionalism was born of a dispute centered on the deeply problematic relationship between Greek rationalist philosophy and the dogmas of the Abrahamic religions that seemed incommensurable with this tradition, namely the doctrine of creation ex nihilo and the possibility of miracles. There was a pervasive tendency in latter antiquity among those educated in Greek philosophy to be embarrassed by the abominations of reason latent in their religious creeds, which impelled them to attempt a synthesis. These attempts to harmonize Abrahamic monotheism with the philosophy of the pagans invariably provoked a reaction from their less philosophically inclined co-religionists who sought to uphold the dogmas of the faith without intellectual rationalizations or prevarications. These reactions divide into two almost diametrically opposed camps, corresponding to the two great bursts of occasionalist thought in the history of philosophy: Islamic and Latin medieval occasionalism. In the Islamic tradition, the thought of the Arab polymath and father of Islamic philosophy, Al-Kindi, marks the tentative beginning of a syncretism of Islam and Greek philosophy. This syncretism was further developed in the 9th and 10th centuries by a school of philosophers known as the Mu'tazilates, the premier representatives of whom were Al-Farabi and Avicenna. The metaphysical system of the Mu'tazilates was a hybrid of Aristotelianism and Neoplatonism typical of late antiquity. Though Al-Farabi and Avicenna remained nominal Muslims, their rationalist philosophical beliefs stood at considerable odds with the depiction of God and His relation to the world in the Quran. Most notably, their critics accused them of denying the Abrahamic doctrine of creation ex nihilo and being incapable on account of their necessitarian conception of causality to explain the existence or possibility of miracles. This latter issue over miracles, in particular, attracted the range of certain Islamic theologians who were followers of a fundamentalist school begun in the early 10th century by Al-Ash'ari, the most illustrious member of whom was Al-Ghazali. Mu'tazilates held in customary rationalist manner that causes are logically sufficient for the production of their effects and thus entail their existence in an essentially logical and syllogistic manner. While any particular cause, for example fire, may not be in itself sufficient for the production of its effect, namely burning, given the presence of certain necessary conditions, for example air and combustible substrate, the effect would follow necessarily from the presence and existence of the cause. That is to say, for fire and a combustible material to be brought together in the presence of oxygen, yet fail to produce burning, was regarded as a logical impossibility tantamount to a formal contradiction. The objection of the Ash'arites to this principle is not difficult to understand. A natural order that operates on the basis of causes that logically necessitate their effects cannot be reconciled with the existence of miracles, which, as attested to in Holy Scriptures, often depend on such an impossible disjunction between cause and effect. For example, there is the famous example of the burning bush, which describes a combustible material that is on fire, but was not consumed by the flames. Another example is a story from the book of Daniel of the three youths, Abednego, Meshach, and Shadrach, who were thrown into Nebuchadnezzar's fiery furnace, yet miraculously escaped burning due to interference by an angel of God. Miracles such as these were interpreted literally by Ash'arite theologians and regarded as involving the presence of a natural cause, but the absence of its customary effect due to a supernatural intervention by God. Cartesian occasionalism. By the time of Descartes, the nature of the occasionalist impulse had changed dramatically. Nowhere among the Cartesian occasionalists does one encounter the deep concern over the divine omnipotence or for reconciling philosophy with the testimony of Scripture typical of the medievals. Even Malebranche, who offered a few theological arguments in favor of occasionalism, never seemed bothered by the particular theological concerns of his medieval predecessors, even though he demonstrated familiarity with them. Instead, Cartesian occasionalism was a tendency and development organic to Cartesianism itself, which the successors of Descartes were driven to pursue exclusively under the pressure of severe problems in the Cartesian systems of physics and metaphysics, and not from any particular religious motivation. The mind-body problem. This problem, while hardly unique to Descartes, was nonetheless forced by his substance dualism into a more radical and metaphysical framework than had been the case otherwise. Now, as noted in the introduction, the classic textbook view of occasionalism as an ad hoc solution to Descartes' mind-body problem is almost entirely without warrant. Nonetheless, the mind-body problem was a particular area of concern for Descartes' successors, and occasionalism provided such a convenient solution that this view took hold with considerable facility. Nonetheless, Stephen Nadler argues that the mind-body problem was not a specific problem engendering Cartesian occasionalism, and moreover was not even recognized as a special case of some more general causal problem. For the Cartesians, the nature of efficient causality was a metaphysical problem in itself. The rejection of scholastic forms and causal powers. Descartes describes the substantial forms of the scholastic as having been introduced by philosophers solely to account for the proper actions of natural things, of which they were supposed to be the principles and basis. Yet Descartes is adamant that no natural action at all can be explained by these substantial forms, insofar as they account for the proper actions of natural things by metaphysical reification rather than epistemological explanation. They are thus occult and inscrutable, and moreover osseous and redundant as explanations of phenomena which, as Descartes is adamant, may be entirely accounted for in terms of local movements. This mechanistic account of causal interaction allowed for a novel argument against the possibility of earthly efficacy, which follows from Descartes' rejection of substantial forms combined with his insistence that the qualities of body are exhausted by their mere geometric extension, and whatever minimal features may be directly derived from as much. The point is, nowhere contained in the purely quantitative idea of extension is any notion of qualitative powers, forms, disposition, potentialities, and the like, from which it may be concluded that matter was essentially passive and inert. Cartesian Nominalism. Unlike the scholastics, who regarded motion to be an accident, the Cartesians regarded motion to be a mode of body, thereby denying the scholastic presumption of a metaphysically real distinction between a thing and its qualities, and instead insisting that there was no ontological difference between the modes of being of a thing and the thing itself. Given this, it would be as impossible to conceive a body transferring its motion to another body as it would be possible to conceive a body transferring its shape or divisibility to another body. Continual creation. Lastly, there is Descartes' acceptance and advancement of the doctrine that God preserves the world via continual creation. This was a customary supposition of occasionalism since Al-Ghazali and the Asherite occasionalists. While Descartes' commitment to this doctrine is insufficiently distinct from what might be maintained by a Thomist concurrentist to qualify incontrovertibly as occasionalism, his successors would interpret the matter more forcefully and in a manner that rendered the concurrence of secondary causes. The place of occasionalism in the history of philosophy. For such a widely deprecated school of philosophy, occasionalism was nonetheless of staggering importance to the development of philosophical modernity. Locke declined to publish 2 essays he wrote against occasionalism because he looked upon to be an opinion that would not spread but was to die of itself, or at least do no great harm. Locke was undoubtedly prescient in this estimation, but only because the influence of occasionalism was to be felt not in its positive metaphysic, but rather in its skeptical epistemology. The first causality of this skepticism was the chimerical Neoplatonism of Ammonius Platonius, which was virtually synonymous with philosophy itself in late antiquity and the early Middle Ages. It was this philosophy that was the primary target of Al-Ghazali's withering criticism. Neoplatonism never recovered from this assault and was instead replaced by the classical Aristotelianism advanced by Muslim philosophers in Al-Andalus, most notably Averroes. In the Latin West, the order was somewhat reversed as the indigenous Platonism of Eriugna, William of Conches, and Abelard was replaced by the influx of Aristotelian ideas arriving north from Moorish Spain. Yet medieval philosophy did not find its completion in the Aristotelian scholasticism of William of Auvergne and Aquinas. Nominalism, the third and final of the great philosophical schools of the Middle Ages, was caustically critical of the pretensions of Thomism, and against such a metaphysic advanced many of the same logical and epistemological arguments made by Al-Ghazali and the Islamic occasionalists. Neither Ockham nor Outercourt were interested in developing a systematic metaphysics and thus refrained from pushing these arguments into an actual espousal of occasionalism. The importance of nominalism lies both in the counter it provided to the domination of Aristotelian scholasticism as well as the not so minor fact that nominalism was the first rigorously empiricist philosophy in Western history. While certain philosophical schools of antiquity, namely Epicureanism and the empiric medical school, had exhibited empiricist tendencies, the general inclination of ancient thought was to either combine rational speculative reasoning with empirical observation or to flatly privilege the former over the latter. No tradition of antiquity had justified empiricism to the same epistemological and metaphysical extent as did Ockham and his followers. As ironic as it might seem concerning a theocentric metaphysics that regarded God as doing basically everything, the cardinal contribution of occasionalism then was to the development of an empiricist epistemology of causal explanation that stood as a cornerstone of modern philosophy and science. The hostility of the occasionalist to secondary causation and the natural potentialities of created things formed the basis of the early modern attack on the occult forces and powers of scholasticism, not only in spirit but in the particular arguments employed as well. A commonly held belief of ancient metaphysics and natural philosophy was that the inviolable regularity of nature must be predicated on the natural activities of things. Even Sextus Empiricus, the arch skeptic, warns, if cause were non-existent, everything would have been produced by everything. And at random, horses, for instance, might be born perchance of flies and elephants of ants. This is a puzzling claim, for if causality were indeed non-existent, nothing would produce anything. Yet, this is not how the ancient mind understood the metaphysics of causation. Production was an ontological given. Causes merely directed the power of the demiurge, ensuring that like produces like and so on. Such an understanding remained in one form or another down to Aquinas and Suarez. Occasionalism, in rejecting the efficacy of such natural causes to guide the operations of nature, was required to posit some principle in its place that would provide for the observed regularity and order therein. The occasionalist response was simple. Given that God was the total cause of every event in nature, the regularity of the natural world was a direct extension of the regularity of the divine mind. In this way, the ancient understanding of nature as governed by active powers and potentialities was replaced by the modern understanding of nature as governed by immutable laws. Lastly, the occasionalist rejection of the necessity of the connection between cause and effect had a direct and undeniable influence on Hume, who was a studious and perceptive reader of Malebranche. Moreover, it was precisely such a skeptical principle that was to finally nail shut the coffin laid on rationalist, speculative natural philosophy once and for all. Let us summarize what we have discussed so far. Occasionalism was developed primarily by Arnold Georlinks and Nicolas Malebranche, 17th century Dutch and 17th, 18th century French philosophers respectively, to solve a specific problem in Cartesian metaphysics. For René Descartes, mind is active, unextended thinking, whereas body is passive, unthinking extension. But these two created substances, the basis of Cartesian dualism, are combined as a third compound substance, the living human. The problem is that the essential unlikeness of mind and body in the Cartesian view makes it difficult to conceive how they can interact, that is, how unextended mental ideas can push the body around and how bodily bumpings can yield ideas. Descartes' opinion that direct interaction takes place in the pineal gland deep within the brain does not answer the question of how. The orthodox view of the French Cartesians Pierre Salvin Regis and Jacques Rault was simply that God has made mind and body so that they interact directly even if scientists do not know how. The occasionalist answer to the question is to show how interaction appears to be direct when in fact it is mediated by the fourth uncreated Cartesian substance, God. Now you can try to answer the questions given here. Explain the concept occasionalism. Describe the development of occasionalism in different stages of philosophy. Illustrate the views of Arnold Georlinks and Nicolas Malebranche on occasionalism. Define occasionalism. Which philosophers are considered as the Cartesian occasionalists? Conservationism can best be described as the common view among the lay followers of the Abrahamic faith. Substantiate. Describe the Islamic and Latin medieval occasionalism. Now you can go through the reference books for further reading. The Cambridge Companion to Arabic Philosophy, edited by R.C. Taylor, P. Adamson, in 2005, published by Cambridge University Press, Cambridge. The Causation Debate in Modern Philosophy, written by K. Clatterbaugh in 1999, published by Routledge, New York. New Essays on the Rationalists, edited by Huneman and Gennaro in 1999, published by Oxford University Press, Oxford. Divine and Human Action, Essays in the Metaphysics of Theism, edited by Thomas V. Morris in 1988, published by Cornell University Press, Ithaca. A Short History of Medieval Philosophy, written by Julius R. Weinberg in 1964, published by Princeton University Press, Princeton. Berkeley and Interpretation, written by Kenneth Winkler in 1989, published by Clarendon Press, Oxford. Thank you for watching this program. We can meet again with another topic. Have a nice day.